Hey everybody, it is your professor, your coding friend, and your new ranch hand. And today we're going to talk about the grid. So as per usual, go to the canvas, pull up the link for today, make sure you're logged in, remix it, go into settings, change it to a name that makes sense to you. And we're going to set this up a little bit different than how we're usually going to, because I have a lot of different grids I want to show you. So we've got different pages that we're working on. So instead of doing the preview window over here, we're going to open up a new window. And to do that, you just come down here and you hit preview, preview in new window. It's going to open up a new tab and I'm going to split screen it. And as far as I know, Apple doesn't have as good of split screening technology as Windows. I'm just going to estimate it like this. All right. And so you can see here that I've got these different pages. And if I click on rows and columns, you'll see the one for rows and columns. So click on that one first. When we need to go to the other examples, we'll just go back to the home page and click on those other links. I'm also doing this so I can show you that you only really need one style sheet for all of your different HTML pages. So for my area page, I have the same style sheet linked here as I do in my index, as I do in here, and so it's bringing in the same style sheet. I don't have to make multiple style sheets for multiple pages. I can just apply one, link it at the top, and it applies to all of my pages. It helps with consistency, limiting the number of files you have to manage, so on. So let's get into grids. So grids work similarly to Flexbox in that they allow you to arrange and organize a lot of individual elements inside of your HTML. So you make all of your elements in HTML, and in your style sheet, you can distribute them in rows and columns in order to organize all of that information. So grids allow you to use both rows and columns. And in order to set them up, you, just like with Flexbox, you say display : and then instead of flex, you say grid. And just like with flex, you can also do inline grid if you want to have multiple grids next to each other. Okay. Unlike with flex, when you do grid, it won't automatically put them all on the same line. So when you start with flex, and you say, hey, this is flex, all of its children will now be in line with each other. When you do grid, it's not going to do that. They're still going to be moving to the next line. Okay, so let's see how it works. So our first thing is we're just going to apply grid to .grid. So if I look at my HTML for the one that I'm on, columns and rows and columns, you can see that this div that holds all these little boxes is called grid. And so in my CSS, I can go down to my .grid and I can add into here display : grid, and I've applied grid. So just like with flex, you apply grid to the container that has the elements that you want to move around. So this is this big box that's holding all of these little green items, and I've turned it into a grid. So when we're doing new window, in order to see the changes that we've done, we have to hit refresh. It won't automatically update like it does when we look at the preview. So I'm going to hit refresh, and there we go. So they're still stacked on top of each other, but now they're filling up this whole space. Yeah. Okay. So columns. A lot of websites use columns more than they use rows. And so when you need to set up your columns to get your column grid going, you put in the code grid-template-columns. And this lets the CSS know that you're trying to divide the space into columns. The number of numbers that you put into it, separated by spaces, indicates the number of columns that you want to have. So here in this example, I have two columns. The first column is going to be 100 pixels wide, and the second column is going to be 200 pixels wide. Right now I'm going to tell you about 2 units. I'll show you some other units. later. But the first units that you're used to is the percent and the pixel. So pixel is just the same unit you've always been using. You say 50 pixels, it's going to be 50 pixels wide. If you say percent, that's going to be based off of the width of the container. So here I have a width of 500. If I say 50%, then this grid is going to be 50% of the width. It's not going to be 50% of the remaining space or 50% of the row space or the column space or whatever. It's going to look at this width here and I'm going to say, okay, it's 250. It'll be 250 pixels. So this percentage is based off of the width of the container. All right, so let's go and do that business. So in .grid, we're going to add a grid-template-columns, and we are going to, sorry, I'm pulling up my notes so I don't have to keep referencing back and forth. We're going to make our first column 100 pixels, our second column 50%, and our third column 200 pixels. Okay, so back in here, back in our style.css, I'm going to go to grid, I'm going to add a new line, and I'm going to add some columns. So the line for that is grid dash template dash columns colon. And so our first column is going to be 100 pixels. Our second column is 50% of the width. So that's going to be 200 pixels. And then 200 pixels. Okay, and let's see how that looks when we apply it. So there we go. So our stuff has rearranged into these rows and these columns, and I've put numbers into these boxes so you can see where they've all shifted around to. So we start with this one, and then it moves the second box into the second row, and the third box, column, and third box into the third column, and then it wraps around 4, 5, 6, and then 7. Okay, because I didn't define how many rows, it's just going to automatically divide up that space. So they're evenly spaced in rows. And here you can see that my 100 pixels is 100 pixels. My 50% is the same as this one over here, because this one I said was 200 pixels wide, and this one I said was 50% of the width. So that's 400 is the width, so that's 200. So these two are the same. And that shows up, that tracks in here. You can set up your grids so that they overflow outside of the width. So I've said that this is a total of 500 pixels wide, so it's larger than the box I put it in. You can have overflow with these things. So you need to keep track of your digits if that's not what you want. Okay. Moving on to rows. Okay, so you can also define rows. So whereas in Flexbox, in order to get like rows or columns, you had to do wrap. Here you can actually define the rows and the columns. So to define rows, it's very similar. You do grid template again, except now you say rows, and again, the spaces indicate the next one. So here I have 3 rows, the first 20%, the second 10%, the third 400 pixels. Okay, so let's put that in there. We're going to add some rows to our grid, and we're going to use these digits. So in .grid, I'm going to add a new line, grid-template-rows. That's also something that is going to mess you up as you go. Remember that it is plural, rows, columns. Okay, and so our first row is going to be 40%. Our next row is going to be 50%, and our next row is going to be 50 pixels, semicolon. Okay, and to see our changes, again, we just refresh this page, and so there you go. Our first row is 40, our second row is 50, and then itty bitty down here is 50 pixels. Okay. All right. So that is a lot to type out. So you can shorthand it and do grid template. So the last few are grid template columns and grid template rows. If you just say grid template, you can put just on one line both the rows and the columns. So you have first your rows, and then you put slash, and then you put your columns. And it works the same way. So here I have 2 rows, and here I have 3 columns. So keep track. You need spaces between each of these numbers to indicate a new row or column, and you need this slash to indicate, okay, my rows have ended, my column hath begun. All right, so we're going to make our code more concise. We're going to redo the code we just wrote, and we are going to simplify it into just grid template, so it's all on one line together. Okay, so you can either delete these 2 lines or you can comment it out. I'm going to comment it out. Oh, whoops, I'm doing HTML. Slash is slash star, star slash, or you can just delete them. It's fine. But leaving them up makes it easier for me to see what I'm changing. So grid dash template, colon, and then I do my rows first. So that's 40%, space 50%, space 50 pixels, space slash space, and then my columns, 100 pixels, 50%, 200 pixels, semicolon. Okay, and so now if I refresh, it looks exactly the same, but now it's just one line of code, which is nice. If you have a hard time remembering this, don't worry, you can still use the one above, that's fine. This is just simpler visually, but just do whatever works for you, man. All right, so far we've been using percent and pixels. The FR, or fraction, is a unit specific to the grid. It's relative to, it's a relative unit for the grid. I'm going to say that with words that make sense. So this is a way you can prevent overflow. So before, when we were using percentage, it's possible to overflow outside of your grid, but with FR, you're using a fraction of the remaining space. So it won't ever overflow your grid. Whatever is left over, it will do that space for it. And it indicates how much space something is taking up. So here I have 2, 1, 1 for a total of 4. So there's 4 FR here total. And I'm saying this is taking up 2 units, this is taking up 1, and this is taking up 1, which means that this one is going to be twice as big as these other 2. So, and then for this one, I've got 1, 3, 4, or sorry, 1, 3, 1. So that's 5. So this is 3/5, 1/5, 1/5. So you can see how it works. It's fractions. So they will only take up the amount of space that is inside of that grid system. It's not going to push it outside of that box. It's going to evenly divide it up based on the numbers that you give them. And because I have these spaces between them, it's indicating that this is one column, this is another column, this is another column. Okay, so to show you how it works, oh yeah, also, you don't have to use one or the other. You can use pixels, you can use percentage, you can use fraction, you can mix them all up together, it's totally fine. They will all play and mix and get along. So if you have something that needs to be a specific width, that's okay, you can put it in there and then have everything else be FR or percent or whatever. Okay, so we're going to go in and we're going to make these changes to use the FR unit. So we're going to make the middle column take up half of the space and then give the remaining space to the first and the last column. So to show you what that looks like, we're going to go into grid and we're going to just change up what we have going already. So I want to have evenly spaced rows. So I want each of these rows to be the same width, height, same height. So I'm just going to say 1 FR space 1 FR space 1 FR. So that's 3 rows that are equally spaced. And I'm going to just bloop. And there we go. It did it. Okay. I wanted something a little more complicated for my columns. So I want this middle one to be twice as big as the other ones. So that's 2 FR, 1 FR, 1FR. Okay. And there we go. So this is twice as big, and then I've got these two evenly spaced ones on the side. And it will evenly divide up that space no matter how wide or tall this box is. So don't do this, but I'm going to show you. If I change this to 6 and this to 5, whatever, I'll change it to 6. If I do that, pew, it still fills up that space. So it's really nice if you ever need to change up the size of something on your website. You don't have to go in and redo all of your rows and columns. It'll automatically readjust because it's a relative unit. And I'll put my numbers back to how they were. Okay. Cool. I love FR. It's beautiful. Okay. Another really nice thing is repeat. So you may have like 12 columns, and it will suck to say 1FR, 1FR, 1F 12 times. So what you can do instead is use repeat and just say, hey, repeat 3 times this unit. So the first number, well, okay, you say repeat, colon, and then the first number is how many times this is going to repeat, comma, and then the unit that you want to repeat. And you can have as many of these as you want. It can be pixels, percent, FR. You can even put more than one. So here it's 20 and 50, and it's going to repeat that twice. So it'll do 20 and then 50 and then 20 and then 50. And you can go on and on as many as you want. It'll just repeat that sequence as often as you tell it to. It's really nice. Saves you a lot of typing. So we're going to go in and we're going to change up our other page. We're going to go to Grid Repeat, and we're going to create some rows and columns using repeat. And so this is what we're going to make. I'll say it out loud again as we do it. So first up, we need to go to our repeat page just to see the changes that we're making. So we're going to click here and go home, and we're going to hit repeat here. Bloop. And we're on our repeat page. Cool. So I have Grid Repeat right here. This is just the class that I've given to this box on this page. So it's working the same way as Grid above. We're just on a different page now. And I'm going to give it Grid Template to set up some rows and columns. And I want to use repeat. So I want, just like up here, I want 3 evenly spaced rows. And I could do 1FR, 1FR, 1FR again. That will totally work. But to save me some time, I'm going to say repeat, parentheses, 3, comma, 1FR. So that's going to give me 3 evenly spaced rows. And then I'm going to do slash. So I can do my columns. I'm going to say repeat. I'm going to say 2. So it's going to repeat this twice. I'm going to say 3 FR and 1 FR. So let's see what that does. Oh. What did I mess up? Property unknown. Ah! Template. Not tempate. There it goes. Okay, so here I am. I've got 3 evenly spaced rows because I said repeat 1FR 3 times. So that's evenly spacing these rows. And I said do 3FR, 1FR, and repeat it twice. So 3FR, 1FR, 3FR, 1FR. So this is 3 times as big as this space. Is that how fractions work? This is 3/4 and this is 1/4. Maths. It's all about maths. Okay, so our next thing that I want to introduce other than nifty repeat is MinMax. So sometimes you want something to be relative or responsive to the web page, and 1FR is really nice for that because if you have a box that shrinks and gets bigger with like mobile and desktop, or when someone readjusts the size of their page and it gets bigger, 1FR will get bigger with it and just fill in that space, and it's beautiful. But then when someone scales it down to be onto mobile, maybe that text box, the text starts getting cut off. And so you decide, well, I'm okay with it getting as big as it needs to, but it at least has to be this big in order to show the text or the image. You can use MinMax. So here I've got 2 columns. The first column is 1 FR, so it's taking up 1 unit. And then I have my second column, because I spaced, I've got a new digit here, and it's MinMax, parentheses. And so it goes in the order that you put them in. So min, minimum is 100 pixels, comma, maximum. So at maximum, it can be 1 FR, so these two at max will be the same width. But if my screen gets small, it will ignore this if it gets to 100 pixels. If it gets to 100 pixels and it tries to shrink to 90, it'll go, not anymore. I am 100 pixels. As soon as it starts growing again, it will start growing. But it will prevent it from getting too small. And you decide what is too small. All right, so we're going to change it up. We're going to go into our MinMax page. And inside of .grid in our style.css, we are going to create 3 even rows and 2 columns, the second one using this MinMax, just to show you how it be. So we're going to go back to home. We're going to go to our MinMax. Okay, this is our MinMax. So to show you how responsive websites work, I just took off the width. This little container box got no width on it. Okay. So down here in my grid.minmax, this is the class that I gave to this bad boy here. You can see there's no width in it like the other ones do. And I'm going to give it a grid dash template. And I'm going to do same thing as before, repeat 3, comma, space 1 FR. And now I'm going to do my columns 1 FR. Space, min, max, parentheses, 400 pixels. So it cannot get smaller than 400 pixels, the second column. And then maximum, so that's comma space 1 FR. And then I'll put a semicolon at the end for good measure. I'll update this. Okay, so I got my 3 even rows. I've got my 2 columns. They are evenly spaced. And if I scale this up, they're still evenly spaced. But then they are not. But then they are no longer twins, they are enemies. And the column that I have 1 FR on is going to continue to just take up the remaining space. But this one that I said no, not below 400 pixels, it's going to stay that large. And that's great if you have like an image or some text that you don't want to get cut off. Cool beans. Another really cool little tidbit is gap. So if you have been wanting to add gutters to your grid systems, to your items, you can use gap. So that's going to create space between your items. It is not going to create space on the outside of your items. This is not the margin, this is the gutters, the space between your modules. So, and it also cuts into FR. So whatever space is remaining, it's also going to take in consideration gap, and it's going to squeeze itself down a little bit smaller so that you have room for that gap. So it looks like this. You say row dash gap 20, or column dash gap 10, and so you can have space between your rows that's 20, or space between your columns that's 10, or you can do the shorthand version that is gap rows columns. So again, it's just the space there. Okay, let's show you what the gap looks like. So mind the gap. So we're just gonna go ahead and just use the MinMax for this. We're already in here. We're already here. So let's do gap colon, and we're just gonna do 20 pixels and 5 pixels. That's what it looks like. So we've got 20 pixels between our rows. So that's what we put here for our first number, and then 5 between our columns. And you can see there's no space between the item and the edge of the box. It's just between the items, the gap. Okay. Moving on to our final example, we're talking about the area. So by default, grid items, these little boxes that are inside of our container, that we're shoving around and putting in rows and columns. They take up one square, one module, one intersection of a row and a column. But it doesn't have to. You can overwrite it and tell it to be more. It can be more. And so you can make it do multiple rows or multiple columns. To do multiple rows, you have to indicate where you want it to start and where you want it to end. And it's using grid lines. So each line of the grid is numbered. The first, like the far left edge is 1, and then 2, and then 3. This makes more sense here. So the far left side, where it begins, that first guide there, that's 1. And then the end of that first column, that guide there, that's 2. So when you're doing it, you're saying, hey, I want this for, sorry, Leica, come on, girl. You can't be yelling. No yelling. All right, so if I wanted this first little element to go all the way from the beginning to the end, I would say start at 1 and end at 4. Okay? Same thing for rows. If I wanted the row to start here and end at 3, I would say 1, 3. Okay. So to show you how this goes, you would say grid row start 1, so that would be at the beginning. Then grid row 3, for my example, it would have been at the end. So this is, it takes up 2 rows, row 1 and row 2. Boop. So let's just look at it visually, because that's better. So we're going to go to our area page, the page where we're going to mess with the size of our boxes. And then the CSS, we're going to go to .1, which is the class that I gave to the first little box that has the letter 1 in it, number 1 in it. We're going to do grid row start and grid row end, and we're going to make it take up this much space. Okay. So go back home, go to area, beautiful. We're going to go down in here to 1, which is the class of this guy right here. And we're going to add grid row start 1 semicolon, and that's going to tell this one to start here at the very beginning. And I'm going to tell it grid row end 3. And that's going to tell it to end. So this is 1. So then this would be 2. So then this would be 3. So it's going to end or start here, end here. Let's see if that's accurate. Oh, I'm using rows. Thank you. So I did grid row. So obviously it's going to fill up the rows. Lord. Okay. So this is 1, 2, 3. And it did it. It did do the thing. All right. So we're going to abbreviate this. Again, there is a shorthand as there is for all things. Instead of doing grid row start, grid row end, you can just say a number / the end number, and you're all good. You don't have to keep adding lines and lines of code. So let's go in and change that up. Instead of grid row start, grid row end, we're just going to put 1/3. Okay, so you can delete these or comment them out. That's just /**//. I'm going to do grid-row 1/3. Cha-ching. And it's going to do the same thing. Excellent. Glorious. Same thing for columns. Yes, you can do grid column start, grid column end, or do the beautiful abbreviation start/end, and it works the same way with that first far left spot being 1, and then 2 and 3, as you go. If this is getting, if keeping track of what the end number is annoying, because it's always like the column you want it to end at +1, and it gets kind of fussy. If you just know how wide you want it to be, you can use the word span. So you can put it on either side. You can put it at the first unit or the second unit. But what you're doing is specifying the number of columns or rows that you want it to take up. So here for grid column, I've said I want it to start at 4, and I want it to span 2 columns. So instead of calculating what the end column line is going to be, and I'm worried that I'm going to mess it up, I can just say, look, just be 2 wide, and it will auto-calculate it for you. So let's add that in. We're going to do grid-row, start at 1, span 3, and grid column, start at 2, span 2 for our dot 2. I'll show you as I'm going to repeat that. All right, so in dot 2, we're going to say grid dash row. And then we're going to say, and 2 is just this one with the number 2 in it. I'm going to say, hey bud, please start on the first line for the row, and please be 3 rows tall. And if I hit this, boop, there it goes. So it started here, and then this would be 2, and this would be 3, and this would be 4. So it's taking up 3 rows. It's ending at 4, but I didn't have to calculate that. I just said B3, and it was. All right, and then we're going to do that for grid column 2 / span 2. So what this is saying is, hey, start on the second line and then be 2 columns wide. And since we're talking about 2, so this is the first one, and this is the second one, so it shouldn't move. And then I want it to be 2 wide, so it's going to be, this is 1, so it's going to shove itself into this space here. Bam! And there it goes. So I've taken this one area and I've made it super big, which is really nice. You can see how this could easily become some sort of complex layout. So you can shorthand it even more. So you know how we did grid row start, grid row end, and we turned it into grid row? Well, you can condense it even further down and just do grid area, and and you don't need grid row and grid column. You just need grid area. And so it looks like this. It starts with grid row start, grid column start, grid row end, grid column end. Row start, column start, row end, column end. Yes, it's a lot to keep track of, but look how condensed it is. It's so condensed. Okay, so let's use this condensed version. So we're going to say for our dot 4, our last little selector there, we're going to use grid area, and we're going to have our fourth block take up rows 4 and 5, and we're going to have our fourth block take up columns 1 through 3. And so it looks like this. So it starts on 4, and it's going to span 2 for rows, and then it's going to start on column 1 and take up 3 spaces. So just put it in, see how it looks. All right. It's bad for the words, but it's good for the eyes. Okay, so we're going to say in dot 4, we're going to put in grid dash area. That's the command for the condensed version. And we're going to say, hey, this one's going to start on the row line for 4, and it's going to start on the column line 1, and it's going to take up 2 rows, and it's going to take up 3 columns. And so this guy is going to end up changing. So we're going to, boop, and there he goes. All right. So there he goes. He takes up this whole huge whole space. Good on him. So that's grid area. It condenses grid row and grid column together. If that's too much to remember in just a single spot, you can go ahead and just use the separate ones. But if you want to be condensed and precise, you can use this one. Yes. Oh, yeah. Sorry. I'm doing maths in my head. All right. So, just to review, we're done with grid. We did it. So to review, we talked about applying grid to containers in order to move around its children within it. We've talked about how to create both rows and columns, how to add gutters in using gap, and how to use grid area to make those individual items take up more space than the default. So it's a little complicated, but man, it's super powerful. Next class, we're going to do an exercise that reviews all of this stuff. And I hope y'all had a good spring break, and I will see you then.